finding yourself in transition. As the topic of the series that we are currently doing in classes on Wednesday night, and as the basis for my messages on Sunday during this time, because we as a church are in transition, and so many people in this congregation are experiencing major transitions in their lives. We've had so many members and so many members' parents, for example, make their transitions recently. We have new babies being born. We have people changing jobs. We have a lot of coming and going. And I would be remiss if this morning I did not honor the passing of a couple people who are very close to this congregation. One is our very own Dr. Steve's grandfather, who made his transition last night. Sorry, Steve, I probably should have mentioned I was going to mention this. But I just wanted to honor him. Your grandmother also made her transition a couple of months ago, right? They were survivors of the Holocaust and lived tremendous lives. And, he is certainly a testimony to all that they accomplished. And he was 94. Yeah. And, kind of shockingly, at the other end of the spectrum, our very own Nabila Shanara's grandbaby just made a transition yesterday after traveling across country on a plane. No idea what happened. And that's one of those transitions that is difficult to make sense of. And so during this time, I simply ask that we all keep them, both those families, in our thoughts and prayers, along with the families of everyone else who has experienced transition, both in our community and all around us. It's a simple reminder that life does not stand still, and things happen that the only way we can be prepared for is through our continuing experience of God. When we talk about the peace that passes all understanding, that's the peace that we find in God, in the experience of God, in meditation, in prayer, in reading those things either in Scripture or in other very meaningful texts that touch our hearts, that open us up to things that are larger than we are. There's so much beyond our understanding. As he lay dying, Hamlet said to Horatio, "There is more in heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy." And there are times like this when we need to remember that. We don't have to make sense with it, but for our good and for the world's good, we must make peace with it. When we deal with endings, we as a culture tend to not do a very good job of it. We tend to, that's okay, come on up. When we deal with endings, we as a culture tend to have problems with it. We sometimes either fall short or overshoot the mark. We do a pretty good job of celebrating beginnings. We like to celebrate births and weddings. Like I mentioned last week, we call a high school graduation a commencement. We're starting something new. We didn't end anything. But we just don't do a good job of honoring those things that have passed. I guess especially in my particular situation, was considering why we have bachelor parties before weddings instead of when you get divorced. Now I'm a bachelor, right? I mean, before you get married, you should have a bunch of married guys should take you to meet Bob at Home Depot and off to, visit Toys R Us and explain all the stuff on the feminine products aisle at CVS to you. Because you're going to be there, right? That's what should happen before you get started. It's like with bridal showers. You got two people coming together. They should have two of everything already. They don't need any more stuff. When you get divorced, it's like half your house is gone. That's when you need a shower. No, I'm not throwing anything out there. It's just trying to use the material I've got. It's like Donald Rumsfeld said, you go to war with the army you got. So, anyway, yeah. Robert Brummett, in Finding Yourself in Transition, said something that really made a lot of sense about endings to me, and it's something that I think we all need to learn from. And he says that we can truly experience a new beginning only when we have fully dealt with the ending that preceded it. Otherwise, we simply carry the unfinished business of the past into the future. Does anybody ever feel like that's happened to them? Why did I marry that guy again? Even if it's not the same guy. It's the same guy, right? Why did I take that same job? I'll leave out the adjective there because there's not a good one for the platform. Why did I take that same job? Why am I working for the same tyrant? Why are all these things showing up in my life again? It's because we didn't deal with them before. We thought that just maybe by sort of moving on, it would be different. But the problem is we took us with us. Wherever it was we went. In the rooms of 12-step, we call that attempting to do a geographic solution. Man, I just really crashed and burned in, name my last city. I'm going to move, and it'll all be better there. It's like that old story about the keeper of the gates. A gatekeeper by a large city has a man approach him, and the man says, so what are the people like here? And the gatekeeper says, well, what were the people like where you last lived? And he said, oh man, they were awful. Mean people, hateful, gossiped all the time, couldn't stand them, had to leave. And the gatekeeper said, well, people are like that here too. He's like, all right, well, I'm going to keep moving on. A little while later, a woman comes up to the gatekeeper and says, tell me, what are the people like here? And the gatekeeper says, well, what were the people like in the last place you were? And she said, oh, they were wonderful. I just loved them. They're also kind and happy and friendly. And he said, well, people are like that here too. Come on in. And she did. It's up to us to do our work with an ending before we can really be ready to move on to a new beginning. One of the biggest reasons that we tend to have in not fully processing endings is we don't want to experience grief. We, are always told, or very often told, especially, those of us of the male gender, to kind of suck it up and drive on. Slap, rub some dirt in it, take a lap, slap a Band-Aid on it. Be a man. Men don't cry. And we just have to stuff it. And so what ends up happening is we have all this unexpressed grief just lingering around inside of us. Eckhart Tolle talks about us having a pain body, right? And that's a very obvious manifestation of our unexpressed grief. You may know some people who will dry at the drop of a hat. There's a very good chance that they have had grief in their life that they've never fully walked all the way through. And, the grief process can be a little messy sometimes. It can be a little loud sometimes. It's one of those things that, is uncomfortable for those of us who are watching people walk through it. Very often we would rather people would just be quiet and, get over it. But it's one of those places where we as human beings are called to minister to one another in our everyday lives, to love one another through our grief and through our pain, and to help all of us get to the other side of what that is so we can be ready to begin anew. So many of us don't even recognize all the stages of grief. It starts out with denial, which, many of us stay stuck there. And then we get into bargaining. If I'll just be like this, I'll change, I'll do this, whatever. Okay, God, if you'll just let them live, take me, that's fine. And then very often we get into anger, which is difficult for some of us to express. A lot of women have difficulty expressing anger. They were taught, growing up, just like guys were taught that you couldn't express weakness. It's okay to be angry. A lot of women were taught you can't be angry, but it's okay to be weak. How about if it's just okay to be us, who we are in the moment? How about that? And sometimes, we may need some support, and sometimes we may need to get a little angry. And then after we get angry, we may get depressed. We may feel down in the dumps about it. That's also difficult sometimes for people to watch. We worry about people. We try to cheer them up. Sometimes they just need us to sit next to them and hand them a hanky. Say, yeah, I get it. Then finally we get to that thing that really heals us, and that's acceptance. The thing about grief is, like the transition process, those stages are not cleanly defined. And we backslide from time to time, I may think that I've been in acceptance, and suddenly I'm depressed again, or may get angry. I may go all the way back to denial and start over again. But it's okay. In class, Robert used to tell us that grief takes as long as it takes. There's no right or wrong way to do it. I guess if there were a wrong way to do it, it would be to not do it all the way through. To just kind of get stuck somewhere along the way. Or to just attempt to stuff it and not talk about it, not address it. Pretend it's not there. Which so many of us have done. I have so many times in my life. Doesn't work very well. So it's important that we allow ourselves to feel that. Then, at the other end of the spectrum is kind of going a little too far. And what Robert says is anytime we see an ending as an absolute finality rather than the beginning of the transition process, we may be taking it too seriously. Just because this thing, whatever this thing is, has ended does not mean it's the end of us. How many of you are familiar with the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet? Yeah, most everybody? So if you remember the very end of the play, Romeo and Juliet sneak off to get married, and Juliet's parents catch wind of it. So the friar has hooked her up with this stuff that'll make it seem like she died. It's like a little potion. And she's going to pretend to die so that she can go off and be married with Romeo. So Romeo's elsewhere, and he's involved in sword fights, and it's all very dramatic. But Juliet's been laid out in this tomb, so her family will think she's dead. And Romeo comes across her, and unfortunately, he didn't have Robert in class. And rather than accepting that this is not the end, he takes his dagger and he shoves it into his chest and falls over dead. So Juliet wakes up, and instead of finding Romeo alive and waiting for her, he's there dead. So she figures it's all over with. She grabs his dagger and she dies, and that's the end of the play. Now, if they'd just been patient, it would have been a comedy instead of a tragedy. So that's the difference in Shakespeare comedies. At the end of a Shakespeare comedy, people get married. At the end of a tragedy, they die. They took that ending too seriously. They took it as it's all over with, game over, that's it, that's all I've got to live for, I'm done. It's amazing. I mean, I think about the life that Steve's grandparents must have lived, to have been a Jew in Nazi Germany and to be hauled off to one of those camps. How many of the people who died in those camps died of a broken heart? You know, laid down and died, instead of somehow finding within themselves that knowledge that's it ain't over. It ain't over till I say it's over. And going on from that. It's amazing what human will can do in either direction. When we decide it's time to give up, we can literally make ourselves sick enough to die. But when we decide it's time to live, we can overcome tremendous obstacles. Odds that nobody would want to make a bet on. We can do that. Now, what happens to us when we get to an ending is very often we are confronted by the 4 disses that Robert talks about. Disengagement, disidentification, disenchantment, and disorientation. And I could spend a long time unpacking all of those. But if we take their root words, engagement, identification, enchantment, and orientation, those are all things that feel kind of good, right? Endings tend to upset that natural order. All those things answer questions like, who am I? What part do I play in the universe? What am I here to do? What is this world really all about? When we become disengaged, we have to kind of release the interlockings. That's, a definition of engagement. Those things that bind us to whatever it was, whether it's another human being or a job, simply a way of living. Identification is all about who we are. I can tell you that, I had as part of my identity that I was Christine's husband. And that's been a tough thing to let go of. And it's the same thing for everyone who has to go through some kind of a change. When we're let go of by an employer, we may have had a very large part of our persona in that job. May have been very proud of doing that job. And suddenly it's like, I don't know who I am anymore. Enchantment is about being under a spell. And to some extent, we are all enchanted by our culture. We are living under some illusions. Some of them are very public, and we have them together as a society, while some of them are very personal. But when a huge change comes along in our life, we may suddenly see it's not what I thought it was. And that's very disturbing. Which gets us to the last dis, which is disoriented. We don't know which way's up sometimes. When I came home from the desert, I had just come back from a year in Kuwait, out in a little outpost in the middle of nowhere in the desert. And I was staying with Christine. I'd actually left from Florida. We got married while I was overseas, and then I came back and went to Santa Barbara. Now, it was a lot better any way you can think about it, right? Instead of sharing a little hooch with Chief Gerard, I was sharing an apartment with Christine. Instead of walking out into 120 degrees, 35 knot wind filled with sand every day, I was walking out into Santa Barbara. And everything was different. And I got disoriented. I didn't know where to go or what to do. I may have told you all this story before, but one day she just said to me, "Charles, there's something wrong with you, and you're not telling me what it is." And I said, "A lot of days, I don't even want to get out of bed." And when she asked me why, I said, "Because everything's different. Everything. Even though it's an upgrade in every direction. I wear different clothes. I walk down different streets. I sleep in a different bed. I have different children. I go to a different church. I go to different meetings. Everything is different." It took me a while to get my bearings, which is not unusual. But we have to allow ourselves that. We have to allow ourselves some time to get grounded, to remember to breathe, especially in major transitions. So, what does transition look like in spirit? What's the guiding principle that we have? What can we kind of hang our hat on? Well, there's a tremendous story in the Bible about transition, and it takes us, back to almost the beginning of the story of the Israelites, even before they got to Israel. And we're talking about the Exodus from Egypt. Robert uses that as an analogy over these next few parts of the book, and I will be also using it. But it's interesting, if you don't know the story. Does anybody know how the Israelites got to Egypt in the first place? Yeah, I got a couple people nodding their head. There was famine in Israel. And Jacob told his sons, "Hey, go down to Egypt. They have grain down there." And then if you remember that whole story of Jacob and Joseph and, the coat of many colors and all that whole thing, right? Joseph had been sold into slavery in Egypt. So when his brothers get there, he's there, and he's the one in charge of selling the grain. So eventually, they get Israel, which is Jacob and his children and their tribe, to come down to Egypt so they don't starve to death. And so often in our lives, it happens that before we are enslaved by something, before we need to break away from something, it's something that, at least we think, is something we need. That job that we get. I remember when I first went to work for a company, I will leave nameless at the moment, but they were, at the time I went to work for them in 1999, very well thought of in the industry that I was in. And I was very proud of having gone to work there. My previous employer had just transferred me into repping for an area that I had to drive like an hour and a half round trip to get to, and it was not doing well for me. So I found this job right there in Orlando, and with an extremely well thought of employer, had great benefits, took really good care of their people. They groomed people, kept them in the system. They wanted to keep them there long term. And it was wonderful until about 2005, 2006, when some new leadership came in and they got rid of the executive vice president who had built that culture of treating employees well. And their words, not mine, decided that, we were all no better than people who worked at McDonald's, and started making some really drastic cuts in things. There was an effort to unionize the place, which can tell you how bad that got. Long story short, 2009, they laid 17 of us off. We were all senior people who were on the older tier of benefits, the ones that had been there before those guys showed up. And it's funny how by the time that happened, my heart was already gone. But it was something that I'd needed. It was, there was, at one time, there had been something that had drawn me there. So many of us in who have dealt with addiction at some point or another when we first got into it, like when you first start drinking. I hear this story so many times. It's like I was all alone. I could never socialize with people. I didn't know what to say in public. And then I'd take a couple of drinks and I was the life of the party. I finally felt like I belonged. But at some point, it turned. And instead of becoming something that was useful to us, it becomes our master, just like the Egyptians turned on the Israelites. At one point, and this is, about 300-400 years after Joseph has passed, the Egyptians said, you know what? There's getting to be way too many of these Israelites. We're going to have to make life a little tougher on them. And that's basically when they enslaved them. Now, oddly enough, just like Moses, who was the spark that led the Israelites out of Egypt, was born in captivity and actually raised by the Egyptians. If you remember the story, he was found in a little reed boat by the daughter of the Pharaoh, right? The same guy that had said, we need to kill all the Israelite baby boys. It was essentially a genocidal campaign. We're just going to assimilate all of them. And after growing up in that culture, he killed an Egyptian that he found beating an Israelite, ran off, spent some time in the desert where he was a stranger in a strange land. That's where we get that expression from. But God called him back and said, you're the one that's going to lead these people out. Moses in that story represents the Christ of who we are. And sometimes the Christ of us can be raised up through some extremely dark circumstances. Those very things that hold us in chains may be the things that produce our inner Moses. I know for me, it was my alcoholism and my recovery from it that produced my inner awareness of the Christ in me that allowed my relationship with God to blossom. There are no regrets. I wouldn't go back and change being who I am and changing the disease I have for anything, because it's what led me to my relationship with God, to the Christ of who I am, to my inner Moses that has been leading me out of Egypt all this time. Moses, finally is convinced to go back to Pharaoh and tell him, hey, let my people go. It's time. And Pharaoh, who represents our sense consciousness, the kind of the dude in charge of our sense consciousness, of course says, no, we're not changing this, no. And of course what happens is there are all these plagues. Well, in my other spiritual family, we would call those consequences, handcuffs, summons, wrecked cars, wrecked marriages, all the things that happen to us, those consequences that push us to say, you know what, I got to let that thing go. I got to let it go. And then, even as we are making the move to leave, right? And if you remember this part of the story, or the movie, right, the Ten Commandments, right, when Moses gets them to the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's changed his mind. He's decided, you know what, they can't go, they got to stay. So they've got the chariots and everything, and they're heading after them. Here's the Israelites, they represent us in consciousness, and they are stuck between their past and a future that they don't know how to get through. Water in the Bible always represents the chaos of an infinite universe of choices. And that's the way, I know that when I first went into recovery, I didn't know what was going to happen next. I had no idea what I was doing. It's like, how am I going to get through today? Much less what's next month going to look like. And the answer is one step at a time, one day at a time, sometimes one breath at a time. And I love what God says to Moses. They're all wailing and moaning there at the edge of the Red Sea. Oh, it's too scary. I can't go forward. And the Lord says to Moses, Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Don't sit there whining. Get a move on. Take a step. Step out in faith. Watch what happens. And the chaos parts, and we find a path through it to the promised land. It may take a while, but we get there. When we are willing to allow our endings to be endings, when we are willing to turn within to that Christ of us, that deep part of us that may have been born from the worst of our suffering, when we are willing to just take that one step forward on that day when we are so lost and so disoriented, we don't know where to go. One step forward in faith, trusting in God. Please join me in prayer. Sweet Spirit, today we honor all of the endings that are happening around us. If necessary, we will allow ourselves to grieve. We will be with those who are in grief. And we will not take any of those endings too seriously, because we know that even though it may be frightening, even though we may not know the way, that as we allow our love for you, our trust in you, our faith in you to guide us, our feet will find the way. Today we cease our crying out. We turn within to that Christ Spirit for strength and for the simple knowledge that we are not alone. You are with us every step of the way. And as you are with us, we know that it is up to us to be here for one another, for our friends, for our family, for our community. These endings do not need to be walked through alone. And so we join our hands and our hearts, and we move forward into a sea of infinite possibilities on the path that you lead us. Thank you for this day and this time, sweet Spirit. So it is. Amen.